We welcome you to our continuing roundtable discussion of the Book of Mormon. Today we're going to be handling chapters 33 through 35 of the Book of Alma. I'm Victor Ludlow, a professor of ancient scripture at BYU, and I have three good colleagues here with me today as we discuss these important chapters. We have Stan Johnson here to my left. We have two Terrys, Terry Ball and Terry Svink. We welcome you, and we're just glad to discuss some of these things here together. We're going to start off here with chapter 33, which is a continuation of Alma's and Amulek's work among the Zoramites. Where are we coming from and where are we going in this material here? Terry, help us out.
Well, chapter 3 is kind of a continuation of the dialogue that Alma is having with the poor and the humble of the Zoramites. You remember in chapter 32, he gives this beautiful explanation of how one acquires faith, likening the development of faith to the planting of a seed and raising it to a tree that you harvest the fruit of. And the last part of it, the sweetness and the whiteness and a very powerful fruit that he promises, yes. And when he's done, the people have some questions. And so they come in verse 1 of chapter 33 asking the questions. Now after Alma had spoken these words, they sent forth unto him, desiring to know whether they should believe in one God, that they might obtain the fruit of which he had spoken, or how they should plant the seed, or the word which he had spoken, which he said must be planted in their hearts, or in what manner that they should begin to exercise faith. So he said gaining faith is like planting a seed. Now they ask, how do we plant the seed? We want to do this experiment upon the word. And so I like to look at the rest of this chapter 33 as him giving examples of how one goes about planting the seed. For example, in verse 3, he says, do you remember to have read what Zenos the prophet of old has said concerning prayer? Mm-hmm. And that's an important part of planting the seed. You've got to be praying. Turn the page. What else? Without even looking, you could probably guess what the next one is. If you were telling your children what you have to do to begin to exercise faith to plant the seed, you'd probably list what he does in verse 12 and 13 and 14. Verse 14, I would ask if you've read the scriptures. So you got to be praying. You've got to be reading the scriptures. And then the third thing he presents with an interesting analogy, he talks about how Moses raised up the brazen serpent when they were in the wilderness.
Act of faith.
Yeah, and if they would look to the serpent, they would be healed. And a lot of them didn't obey. And the point is, you have to read the scriptures, you have to be praying, but you also have to obey. That's a good formula for planting the seed and gaining faith, I think.
Well, let's start off and talk, first of all, about some of this insight that Zenos, this prophet of old, we just don't know how much earlier. Of course, by this period of time, we're way past, 5 centuries into the new land, and Zenos was on the brass plates. Concerning prayer or worship, I like that prayer is a genuine part of our worship, and as we do that on our Sabbath and in our families, it's a type of devotion. And I like the structure that is a part of this. Well, I call it almost like a poem on prayer here. He starts off by addressing, I was in the wilderness, someplace where you feel like you're in a hostile, foreign environment or whatever. And then I prayed unto him in my field. Well, there you're on a little more familiar territory. You're close to home. And then in verse 6, in my home, so now you're in a nice, safe, secure environment. And then to be even more special and private, even within my closet or my storeroom.
That's an interesting paradigm. I hadn't noticed that.
Yeah. So
I think it's great counsel for the Zoramites too, because remember, the poor Zoramites have been excluded from worshiping in the synagogue, and so they had to understand that you didn't have to go to the church to pray. You could pray anywhere. And I really appreciate that. One of the best places I found a prayer, this may sound crazy, but I was teaching a class up in Salt Lake, and I had to drive up there 45 minutes. And instead of listening to the radio, I used to turn the radio off and just pray as I drove along the car. I didn't close my eyes.
But everyone else around you was praying too while you were driving, right?
and I just found that this when I got to after praying in the car for the full 45 minutes, the class, they were some of the best classes I've ever had, and that's a lesson I think sometimes we think we have that the formal prayers are the most important. When I think the individual prayers where we open up our hearts and pour them out to God, I think those are the most important prayers that we can offer, and I think that's one of the things that Zenos is teaching right here.
I just read an article by President Eyring, and he mentioned the key to having the Spirit, to being able to do the will of the Father, is to daily search the Scriptures and pray the prayer of faith. He said, there's your key. And I think that's what we've got here, the prayer of faith and the study of the Scriptures. I also like this idea of verse 4 and 5, right at the first, thou art merciful. Verse 5, thou wast merciful, speaking of God. Verse 8, thou art merciful. Verse 9, right at the first, thou hast been merciful. Mm-hmm. Then you go to verse 11 and 13 and 16, right at the end of it, exactly the same words, because of thy Son, because of thy Son, because of thy Son. And I heard a good friend say, if you really want to know what's important in the Scriptures, note those things that are repeated. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's the message of the book, that we can come unto our Father in heaven and receive all of His blessings because of the Son.
There's also another little paradigm in here that I find of interest. In verse 8, he's talking about thy children and talking about using some terms that we think of with family. And then in verse 9, you've heard my cries in the midst of thy congregations, or we would say when we're, at church or among friends. And then he goes on and talks again about enemies that haven't been so softened as the earlier ones that were mentioned. And so we have different family and social circumstances as well that should be incorporated within our prayers. Well, any other discussion here on this little verses? What do we have here? 4 through 11 here, summarizing, concluding, as you said, Stan. Thou hast turned thy judgments from me because of thy Son, and then he addresses the group and says, "Do you believe these things?" Well, then remember, he has said, thou hast turned away thy judgments because of thy Son. And he's then ready to shift to a new set of instructions, moving from the teachings of the Scriptures, but basically to teach him about the Son of God. And he mentions another prophet from the brass plates, but we learn something new about this prophet besides some of his teachings in this passage. Do you recall?